welcome to SIIMCast, a podcast brought to you by the Society for Imaging, Informatics, and Medicine.
Welcome to this week's episode of SIIMCast. This week, we'll be discussing deployment of home reading workstations. We thought that this would be a germane topic given the current pandemic crisis. The format is a little different than our prior recordings in that while the first part is the usual question and answer between the host and the guest, but the second part are questions from our live audience. We thought that this would be an interesting way of getting real-time questions and answers from our guests and questions that we may not have thought of prior to the show. Our guests this week are Dennison, Carl Swanson, and Ryan Fallon. Dennison is an experienced imaging informatics consultant, a fellow of the College of Society of Imaging Informatics and Medicine, and is a frequent speaker and panelist at SIIM, RSNA, and other conferences. Don has published several articles across the breadth of imaging informatics topic and currently serves as a chair or member on several of the society committees and has recently joined the Journal of Diagnostic Imaging editorial board. Don also chairs the MIIT, an annual imaging informatics conference in Canada. Ryan Fallon is manager of imaging technology services for Johns Hopkins Health System, responsible for managing implementations and operational support of enterprise imaging systems, including PACS, VNA, VR/R, as well as several mini PACS and clinical viewers. Ryan has worked at Johns Hopkins for 8 years with experience in project management, business analysis, and is involved in several industry organizations, as well as being an active member of the SIIM membership committee. Carl Swanson is Senior Director of Imaging Technology at MedStar Health, leads the Imaging Informatics Administrator team across 10 hospitals and more than 40 imaging producing ambulatory practices in the Baltimore, Washington metropolitan region. The Imaging Informatics team supports PACS, voice recognition, data migration, advanced visualization, VNA, EHR integration, AI/ML projects, imaging research projects, enterprise imaging, and analytics. We hope you enjoy this episode as much as we did.
Don, I'll start with you then. Remote reading can mean a lot of different things. Can you define what is typically meant by it?
What I thought I would do to start this off, and I want to reserve majority of the time for Ryan and Carl, who are actually living this life rather than hearing from someone like myself, who's a bit more of an academic approach to it. But I wanted to start off with some basic definitions and concepts, and then some of my initial perspectives. I believe in any time you have an informatics or imaging IT or any type of IT program that you're going to get into, invest effort and money into, like a remote reading one, you should define what it is you expect this thing to solve. What is it going to provide? What benefit is it going to create? What risk is it going to mitigate? And it seems like an obvious thing, but a lot of people kind of skip over it. I'm a believer that IT is a response to a need. So orgs really need to identify what outcomes they're expecting and then measure the effort put into it against what it actually gets out of. It's a very basic approach. And the goals that are defined up front can really affect how the program is designed. And in this particular case, there are a lot of different reasons why people embark on this program. So if the goal is to provide off-hour subspecialty reads rather than outsourcing to a telerad group, you may design this program quite differently than something like a break the glass, emergency, urgent read in rare cases kind of program. If you define goals that are related to productivity and quality, meaning high quality reads involves all the apps that you would use in the reading room being available to them, including post-processing, all the reporting, all the EMR data, all past imaging priors and reports. You want to try to mirror, and you want to try and mirror the environment at home as close as you can in the reading room. Because if I'm reading in the reading room, several days a week with multiple monitors, display protocols optimized for them, peripherals that are optimized for that, and then I go back to a regular one monitor computer, a lot of things have to be done differently. So my productivity is impacted. If you're looking for a strategy, if one of the stated strategies is full business continuity in a crisis like this pandemic is the goal, then you need to support not just, the most critical workflows like urgent case reading, but you have to be able to support on a routine basis educational workflows and teaching workflows like resident attending readout. How do you do that remotely? peer review still has to be met. So you have to look at all your workflows to say, if this is what it's for, and we're not going to be in the office for weeks or months at a time, we can't abandon other commitments beyond just the basic high priority reads. So depending on what or wishes from these type of things should affect and shape its design and the level of investment. And this should also be used to set expectations for your end users like RADs. If RADs have an expectation of, fully replicated in reading room remotely, including all the same desktop hardware, the same level of support, same image performance, same workflows, and all the specialty apps that may come with it, that should be what's communicated, and you should set those as KPIs for people supporting it. If the expectation is a reduced capacity or capability type reading environment, then that should be made clear to them so they don't misset their expectations. And if this is a formal program, I'll define that as being something that's funded, over multiple budget years. It's not just a one-time spend. And you have executive sponsorship to say, we want to make sure this happens, so we will invest the effort to do it. You can use this to attract and retain radiologists who are looking for more of a work-life balance or to work for an organization that does this. And in addition to that, a well-designed user satisfaction survey regarding remote reading can help support that and collect inputs to process improvement. And the last couple of points, if quality is the goal, as I mentioned, you should have access to all of the tools that you have in the reading room, the EMR, all the past data, advanced visualization. You probably want to look at things that allow real-time and near-time. So real-time being like voice and video, and near-time being like chat or instant message. Collaboration tools should be considered, especially if you have to participate in things like tumor boards. And that might be part of your app, or it might be part of a third-party solution that layers on top of, much like we're using today. Any limitations in this type of communication, collaboration, and having to be able to share content with other peers or with referring physicians need to be understood. So for example, if it only works on a single monitor, there should be communication to everybody about that. Performance and information security are just as important in remote settings. Remote desktop, the software management of the remote desktop is likely essential if you have any sizable deployment of that. And the last point I'll make is that what I've seen is a lot of people are talking about, okay, when is cloud going to happen? What are the conditions where cloud makes sense? What are the market triggers that are going to do that? But we also have to consider is how do we get ready for when that comes? And a well-managed remote reading program can be a good stepping stone to help orgs develop necessary policies, define the right roles and the skills and the work practices for all the people who have to make this stuff work before moving to a full cloud-based PACS and reporting deployment. So I know that's a lot of dumping of stuff out, but I wanted to get all my points out front, and then we'll get the real smart people to share their experiences.
Ryan, can you provide a brief description of your standard reading in hospital environment at the moment?
Yeah, sure. So at Johns Hopkins, we are a RIS-driven operation. We typically have a 4-monitor setup that's got desktop integration on the workstation as well. So on our primary leftmost monitor, our EMR and RIS, our RIS is just another module from our EMR vendor that will share the screen with our reporting system. So that's on the left monitor. And then we'll have our medical grade monitors in the middle. We typically have 2 of those with the image display across both of those. Again, that's with desktop integration. The images are launched in that patient context. Then we have a 4th monitor. That's kind of like a personal use monitor. That's where our web desktop for peer review and teaching files and some of our resident tools, typically we'll see that on the 4th monitor. Email, web browsing, we'll have that on that 4th monitor as well.
And then just to clarify, are you guys preparing the workstations for people to work at home, or are they using their own personal setups and you guys are just kind of putting software on it?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so we do have a IT provided home workstation image that we deploy at the radiologist's home. So it is IT managed. It's hardware that we've purchased with investment from the department and from the different divisions. And then it has a standard image with our PACS applications, reporting applications, other imaging systems on that workstation as well.
Great. Carl, can you explain to us your setup?
Yeah, good afternoon. Similar to Ryan, all of our workstations are connected to the domain in the hospitals, and they have the standard encryption and endpoint tools that any other standard workstation would have. We have, in the education environment, we generally have 2 ancillary monitors and then either 2 6MPs, so like a dual fusion setup, or 4 diagnostic monitors. In the community hospitals and in the larger production hospitals, we have a 4-monitor setup with 2 ancillaries and 2 diagnostic monitors. We share the same enterprise chat that all of the standard workstations share, and this was a relatively recent change over the past 2 years that our setups are built in collaboration with enterprise IT. I think it's germane to start talking about things like workstation caching because we may bring that back up. In the hospitals, we have some hospitals in particular that are on less strong links. So even down to 100 megabit per second links in some ambulatory practices where we have radiologists staffed. And even with those, we do not have workstation caching. So we don't have any on workstation prefetch at all deployed in the environment.
Quick follow-up on in-house versus the remote stations. Are all the remote stations relatively new and the same, i.e. they were all purchased within the last year, or are we talking about some amount of machines that are older, like 3 to 5 years, and some of them that are newer, 1 to 3 years? And how does that change how you might approach getting everybody on the same page, particularly when it comes to things like workstation service or troubleshooting for people that are working from home?
From my perspective, we have a 5-year expectation to amortize life over hardware. And we share that expectation at the hospital, and we share it on RAD IT provided workstations to radiologists' homes.
Yep, and this is Ryan. We're in a very similar boat. We use our standard fleet replacement schedule, which is every 3 years for us. So these are all pretty new hardware. The remote reading has been a long-term strategy for us. It's not something that we are just doing as a temporary kind of emergency fix here. So I know we're going to talk about that a little bit later, but the monitors and the workstations are part of a fleet replacement cycle. So they are being refreshed on a regular basis.
So that leads to another question. For people that are doing more of a temporary thing and possibly even a permanent thing, how do you manage expectations between a home workstation and the hospital workstation? For example, quote unquote, medical grade monitors versus off the shelf. Do you have to deal with differences in compression, lossy versus lossless? How do you deal with things like your bandwidth and data caps by home ISPs?
Wow, that's a lot to unpack. So we classify remote readers into 3 buckets. So the first bucket is occasional, and that might be a case or 2 in an emergency. It might be some resident attending workflows where an attending will look at a case. Middle ground is once or twice a week or overflow, like an evening shift. And then we have a remote so-called Nighthawk service inside of MedStar as well, which is full-time production radiologists. And geographically, they range. We're based here on the East Coast in DC, Baltimore, and we have remote readers that range from California to Chicago to Philly to, of course, in the DC area. So our setup changes, frankly, on the monitor side. We have not developed a level of comfort on COTS or commercial off-the-shelf monitors, although we've talked about it a number of times. We provide standard diagnostic grade monitors, although, of course, there are different classifications in the diagnostic category. And within those 3 layers or levels, 1, 2, and 3, where 3 is the full-time production environment, although they're outside the hospital, and 1 is that 1 or 2 case in an emergency, we stratify which monitor we're going to give to the radiologist. Related to compression, we have in migrations and in other scenarios looked at doing things other than lossless compression. We have not yet developed any degree of comfort, despite so many studies on using lossy compression that is not generated from the modality, like an ultrasound cine loop, for example. So at this point, we're currently harmonizing compression on .70, so JPEG lossless .70. And on ingestion, if a study is already compressed on something more exotic like .80, we'll leave it alone. If we can, otherwise we will try to down convert it to .70. And we don't do any lossy compression for home-based reading.
Do you draw a distinction between people who are just reading CTs, MRs, and ultrasounds versus people who need radiography and potentially mammography, particularly with respect to both the bandwidth demands and the monitor demands?
On the MedStar side, at least, we don't have any home-based mammography use cases. We have talked about bunkering some folks remotely in order to read screeners, although we haven't done that at this point. So on the mammo side, we're using 5 MPs inside of the hospital or inside of a specially created reading center in an ambulatory environment. On the monitors, the way that we stratify are we just look at those different grades of users, and then there are different grades of monitors from which we choose that we've already tested with our stack.
And then has any of this changed? I mean, you mentioned 3 buckets, and of course there's going to be a tension between you can't provide the cost of providing every single radiologist in a large system with a workstation for a lot of organizations would be prohibitive. But right now with the COVID crisis, probably a lot of radiologists are trying to work from home. So how have those buckets changed, and where are you finding more and more demand right now?
To be direct, we've been stretched, we've been challenged, we've been pushed. Here on the IT side, we've been asked questions of, well, why can't I use my home workstation? Or have you evaluated, does your current stack leave PHI behind? So in other words, specifically, is there any aspect of PHI that's left behind on the workstation? And does that mean that we could take that workstation and then subsequently leverage it for some kind of home use if it's not provided? And the way that we've personally responded to that here is we've looked at how quickly we can turn around our corporate provided images and said, we need to do that faster than our typical cadence. And we haven't made the stretch yet to say that we are able and willing to have attendings issue final reads from hardware, including monitors that weren't provided by our IT staff. What it's meant specifically is it's traded. Everyone has a problem. That has now moved the problem, as you suggested, Arjun, to a financial problem, because what that means is we now have more demand and a stronger and a quicker demand for turnaround for these home-based use stations that we weren't planning to provide previous to this.
Ryan, can I have you chime in to the same effect?
I can add a few things here. In terms of managing expectations, which was one of the overlying themes of this question, I'd say it's a sliding scale. For us, our remote reading environment started as a luxury for our on-call staff, that then became a necessity as a work from home requirement for some of our divisions, to where we now kind of similar to what Carl was saying, we have remote readers around the country. And for us, our PACS vendor is particularly dependent on network bandwidth. So that's the biggest expectation we have to set. And that was the biggest technical challenge that we've had to work through. Again, this has been a long-term strategy for us going back quite a few years. So we've been working on this for quite a while. So we've already had conversations with our radiologists about recommended bandwidth considerations. We've worked with our enterprise IT team on our VPN throttling. Essentially, despite having business class internet, we have limitations in terms of what bandwidth we can get through our VPN because of the traffic being encrypted and the shared usage among the enterprise. So setting the expectation for not just image display, but how the PACS is loading display protocols, fetching priors, and how that works on a slower internet has been a continuous challenge. Our PACS vendor worked with us to develop different ways to stream images in, to deal with slower internet connections. Our enterprise IT team has worked with us to set up actually like a radiology dedicated VPN that we hope can address some of those kind of shared bandwidth concerns, but really kind of the performance of the PACS, maintaining that efficiency from home, even though it is, IT managed hardware, you're on the Hopkins network because you're through the VPN, we have our desktop integration. So we're trying to simulate that in-house experience when you're at the hospital as much as possible, but we can't do much about the network. And so that's a big part of our focus is on really optimizing the PACS to work well with what would be considered a more limited network speed. We do have the same kind of shift in technical problems becoming financial problems, and especially in terms of inventory. We have, again, beating a dead horse, but this has been a long-term strategy of ours for a while. So most of our attendings are set with home IT managed workstations, but we still want to make sure we have an inventory of imaged managed workstations available to deploy as needed, as our home reader base has kind of expanded exponentially over the past couple of weeks. So, we're mitigating that as best as possible. But the nice thing is because it's been a long-term strategy, we've been able to minimize the need to send like IT staff to radiologist homes since the COVID crisis has kind of ramped up, which helps us be safe and while still maintaining our agility to react to the changing issues as they come.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the use of sending out or deploying IT staff to oversee, installations. I guess the question is always, balancing between security and latency or convenience. Can you talk a little bit about the use of like so-called zero footprint applications versus virtualization and how that has played into your decision making?
Yeah, so for us, I would say the zero footprint utilization is more of a future state, an ideal place that we're trying to get to with our PACS vendor. Again, we have recommended bandwidth considerations for our radiologists. So, many of them have these business class 1 gig internet connections, but because they're connecting through our VPN for security reasons, that's throttling the speeds and they're not really getting the full benefit of what they're paying for from an ISP layer. So if we can get to a point where we have a zero footprint web PACS that, is in a DMZ, to meet all our security compliance standards for opening up applications to the DMZ, and our users could connect from home to the PACS directly through the internet, leveraging their 300 meg or 1 gig connections, then they'll get certainly much better performance to the point where they're approximating what they get on site. That is something that we're hoping to get to. Since we're not there today, for some of our extremely remote users, we have people in Colorado, Nebraska, Mississippi. We started purchasing and deploying what are called, this is a vendor specific thing, but it's a Meraki device, which essentially creates an own dedicated VPN tunnel from the radiologist's home workstation to our network without having to use our client-based VPN. And those have much bigger bandwidth capacity, up to like 200 meg in some cases. So in those cases, for the remote users, they've been able to get that network performance, maintaining our requirement of being on the Hopkins network, but they're reducing the throttling from going through the client VPN. So we have a future state initiative that we're not quite at yet because it's a development project with our PACS vendor. But to mitigate that at this point, we're using hardware-based solutions and continuously working with our enterprise IT team and our network security teams on figuring out the ways to unlock better performance, so to speak.
On the topic of workarounds, particularly in the pandemic crisis we're in right now, we have a user-generated question, which is asking about virtual desktops as a way to remotely control a workstation that is on site, but the user is doing it from home. I know in my own institution, which is in Chicago, but has its corporate IT based in Florida, we have the IT issue that software cannot be installed on non-institution devices due to security concerns. They're claiming at least that non-institution devices, which are not locked down, could be compromised, and then the actual institution gets infiltrated, once the VPN connection is made. So the two workarounds I'm suggesting here are using your own computer at home and then trying to VPN, either using your own software, both dictation and PACS, or using some kind of a remote desktop setting. How realistic are those? Don, I think I'd like to hear from you if you have any input.
Yeah, sure. I think, first of all, it's amazing to me how something becomes an absolute truth until something like the situation we're in now, and all of a sudden creativity is applied. You see how many people are innovating to solve ventilator design and manufacturing and all kinds of techniques. So I think the reality is I'll be blunt, is I think the story that we can't secure a remote desktop is a lazy response. It's not, no one has come with the right argument to prove the value of it and that it's going to put money back into the coffers of the people who have to make the IT investment, to be quite blunt. So I'm not accepting that it's technically not possible. It is just simply an answer that says that's not a priority for us to make those end users satisfied or to provide that as a service. And one thing, I think with, in my career, remote desktoping into things, like, to be honest, it's really been optimized for document, office, browser type use, very basic applications. And they've made a number of improvements over the years to try and support much more dynamic data, high-speed cines and medical imaging, and without introducing artifacts. But it doesn't always meet those expectations. And also, when you're used to dealing with, as Ryan and Carl described, like 4 or 5 monitor setups, each with some landscape, some portrait, different resolutions, different technologies driving them, and then to try to get that working over something like we're looking at here, like Zoom, it's really a step down. It was never, in my opinion, designed to handle that type of thing. And usually the VM farms on the back end are not IT resourced enough to deliver the kind of capabilities to do that virtual desktoping. So practicality-wise, I think basically having a methodology to manage the desktop remotely so that you can apply all your InfoSec policies to that device, usually funded by the health system. If not, if it's supplied by the end user, say a remote reading group, it should be held to the hardware specifications provided by the health system, and the health system should manage that endpoint. Because if you have a compromised endpoint and you VPN in, that's how things can get in. Quite frankly, I think it's just if it's important to you and you set it as a strategic objective for whatever the reasons I stated at the start of this, it can be done. You just have to choose the one that is going to make sense for your cost structure and your management, and then put the IT pieces in place.
It's funny, Don, you're mentioning Artifact, and I mean, we're just looking at a static PowerPoint slide right now, and I see ghosting all over the place. With respect to remoting in, I mean, one component that I've been trying to work with at least is using either a local PACS instance or an enterprise viewer instance. What I want to do is ask my IT people if I could just remote in to use the dictation software component, because that's something that we haven't been able to get to work for some reason. But at least that part, like you're saying, with documents and certain other features that are not image intense, that at least seems like it should work. Whether or not you can get actually dictating into the software, at least generating reports would be nice.
And I think there's pros and cons to everything in each IT solution. So two basic buckets of approaches is one is application deployment. So the data stays in the application, but the application has to be figured out to get to you on the hardware, on the monitors, in the location, over the multiple network hops. So that's one approach. The other is to separate the application and move the data. So we're going to have somehow a standalone cloud system, and we're going to copy the DICOM data up and all the orders up and all prior results up, and then maybe remote in to get things like EMR data and your dictation system so that you can kind of separate those two things. So I think you have to, as an organization, say, okay, what are we trying to solve? What benefits are we trying to create? And then evaluate each of the different solution options and say which one actually is best fitted to what we're trying to do. Because some of them make sense to use in a temporary fashion. I mean, we've done this in the past for upgrades where we have to take systems offline. People will have a business continuity side system that is reduced functionality, not as many priors, but they can deal with it overnight on a weekend. If that's all you're trying to address for the occasional one, that's one thing. Now, those organizations who took that strategy as good enough, I think are probably finding in today's environment that they're a bit flat-footed, and they probably would have benefited from investments like what Ryan and Carl have been describing.
Yeah, this is Ryan. I'll add too that there are some basic technical challenges that probably are resolvable, but because they came up as roadblocks, our organization kind of pivoted in different directions. But, we mentioned like virtual desktops and dictation systems. So, one issue that we ran into, and again, I'm sure there are organizations that have gotten past this, but using like our UVDI virtual desktop environment for dictation, we have a challenge where the microphone can't be detected. The microphone's connected to your home workstation, but you're using a virtual desktop to try to do your recording, and the drivers aren't installed. It's not reading your mic. So those are like basic IT issues that we haven't, again, we ran into roadblocks, so we pivoted in with different directions. Accessing a PACS viewer through a virtual desktop or a Citrix implementation or something along those lines is a great downtime solution. It's a great access solution for users who are on like under-spec workstations. But then you come to a discussion about the fidelity of the images and whether you're getting, for like a plain film reader, the full fidelity image that you need to see going through a Citrix session or going through a virtual desktop. So we start running into some basic IT concerns that have led us to go more the IT managed hardware route in each individual's home rather than kind of promoting more of a virtual desktop or a Citrix environment where it has to be a lot of resources allocated to it, and we have to get past some of these IT roadblocks for hardware reasons and for viewer fidelity reasons.
I guess one thing that I would add that I've seen on the cardiology side, which is a little bit of a hybrid, is I have seen folks RDP in to their reporting client and then use an enterprise viewer to read echoes. And if you give an enterprise viewer maybe 10 seconds or so, eventually that entire set of frames inside of the Cine loops will all load, and then they can be viewed, and then the bridge can be made using RDP. So those kind of intermediate strategies are there, but it's difficult to be put in a position where you would codify that into here is your remote reading strategy and give it in writing to someone. a lot of things on the VPN were discussed. And one of the interesting ones to me is this past, as we've moved more and more non-clinical folks out of the hospitals and out of typical locations where they're on a business network, then they all joined the VPN. So then we have VPN contention, which has put additional pressure on the VPN. We were able to relatively quickly add bandwidth to the VPN, and we were able to create a separate VPN for imaging needs. And having a separate VPN lifted the pressure that existed onto the typical remote VPN. So a little bit of a different strategy than Ryan used, and probably a little bit more crude than Ryan's strategy, but having the imaging VPN segregated from the normal production VPN allowed us to not feel as much pressure when many users were forced to be working remotely.
And actually, Carl, we're going that exact route now as well. Tonight, we're actually deploying a new VPN client to our radiology users that will give them access to a dedicated radiology VPN separate from our enterprise one. So
good.
We're felt that same pressure, and that's the same accommodation that we've been working with our enterprise IT team to make.
Have you guys seen on the clinical side any redistribution of the clinical workflow or change in workflows? I know there's been a drop in imaging studies, at least at my institution, I assume across everyone else too. And the other thing is, what are you doing to ensure that people are actually doing work when they're scheduled to work on their home workstation? Are you keeping track of RVUs? Are you doing anything like that?
Each division chief, I think, probably has their own strategy for making sure that their faculty are working when they're supposed to be working. Again, we've, for the most part, across our different divisions, have had some sort of remote reading rotation built into the radiologist schedule on a regular basis anyway. So it's not a new issue. And really, it comes down to the turnaround time of the reading work list and making sure that the cases are all done. I know that there is some monitoring being done at an RVU level as well. That probably is the best way to track something like that. But we're able to see like when users are logged on, we're able to see when they're signing the reports. And then again, I'm sure the division chiefs are monitoring the RVUs for productivity. Yeah, I think there's a baked in accountability to our radiologists from having used this remote reading program for the past few years.
I wanted to ask one question and then also ask if there were any other topics you guys wanted to touch on before we move to the audience questions. But do you think this crisis is going to change the way your radiology departments work permanently? And then, Don, do you sense that there's going to be a sea change in radiology as well coming out of this? And then also do let us know if there's any topics you wanted to bring up before we move on. I'll start with Carl, please.
I think it's going to be difficult to pry these home workstations from anyone at this point. We've sort of looked at this as anytime we've given a home workstation out, the probability it's coming back is really low. So from a little bit of a change, I think we've been going through a metamorphosis here over the last probably about 3 years as we've joined a number of professional practices together, which is elimination of teleradiology work, full-time final reads, and then the need for additional shifts in the evening. And those have lent themselves to having additional home-based users that often work in the hospitals as well. So sometimes it's better to be, as they say, lucky than good. We were fortunate in a way that this change had started. We were also sort of fortunate in that we were planning a deployment. So we had another, I think about a dozen or 16 workstations on the shelf that we could deploy relatively quickly. So the way that I see it changing is I see that most of those workstations deployed remotely will probably stay deployed. And similar to Ryan, we'll probably start encroaching on maybe a one-to-one or close to a one-to-one other than breast imagers with radiologists that have remote workstations.
Yeah, and then this is Ryan. So what I can add to that, and I completely agree with everything Carl said, there are some ancillary benefits to this, I guess, as well. In addition to imagining that our currently employed faculty will want to increase the number of shifts that they're taking from home and reading remotely, it is a recruiting tool. So, I think we already are seeing it. We're hiring full-time readers in Colorado, Nebraska, North Carolina, Massachusetts. I think you'll probably see a lot more of that happen in the future, where we won't have to necessarily have these location-based on-premise readers. I think it may provide some innovation and optimization in terms of like work list and workload balancing for specialty reading particularly. within our current reading workload solutions, we may see the ability to route studies from community hospitals to the subspecialty reader who's employed by a partner academic center, but may actually be several states away. I know some of the software already is working towards that with varying success, but I think that it's going to probably ramp up and be a bigger priority for institutions and for organizations as a result of the COVID crisis and response.
Yeah, I think in a very broad sense, a year from now, we're going to look back on this and there's going to be all kinds of things that we believed were not possible, turned out to be quite possible with a little bit of concerted effort. I think there have been people who have advocated for telehealth in general for years and not gotten much change in the institutionalized practices of health systems who are now the shining stars right now. There have been people who have been advocating for public health and data analytics for years, and now they're on the front page news every time. They've been dwelling in the shadows. I think there's a lot of things like now that we've been digital for a long time in our business, significantly in radiology, and for the most part in clinical information and billing and other areas. There are still some hospitals using paper in areas. But I think that the tradition of forcing the human to come to the machine and to come to the, very expensive to park in, very difficult to get to, long walks to get to the office to, patient and professional co-mixed areas, that kind of thing has been accepted because it's traditional. It's what used to happen before digital. This will now change how we perceive the broader impact of pure digital systems. So I agree. I don't think you're going to be able to put this back in the box. Things like mobile, things like remote work from home for all general office workers. I'm anticipating that a year from now, there'll be reports showing that productivity actually, once people got past the initial setup, often improved. I mean, there are a number of people who are on this call who work from home on a regular basis, me included, for over 7 years. And my productivity is not affected by at all. I have all the tools I need to do my job. And I think it's just a matter of accepting it. And there's still some cultures, I think, corporate cultures, that if I can't see you in your office every day, then you may not be working hard. But in our world, everything is measured. We know exactly how many procedures there are. We know turnaround times. We know RVUs, exam volumes. So whether you're located here, sitting in the office, or you're in Hawaii to do night reading in daytime hours, or London, England, I think there's going to be institutions that report benefits from having programs like this that, everybody else is going to start saying, well, why haven't we done it? The one last comment I want to make too is a context one, which is a lot of what we're describing is really about within a given large healthcare enterprise, how to address the RADs who are reading for that enterprise. And I've seen some questions in the chat, and this is also something we have to remember. There are a large number of radiologists out there who are reading in private groups and covering multiple hospitals. This is a very different problem to solve, trying to do that remotely and trying to get orders and results and images in and priors and all that stuff and markups back to the system. That's quite a different approach often because you're dealing with 5 different IT departments, none of which are collaborating with each other. It's a different approach that I think needs to be solved.
These are great comments. Thank you guys so much for all your contributions. We wanted to open things up to the audience now, give them an opportunity to voice their questions on air. First question that we have is from Gerard.
Hey, I guess my question was pretty much, I was wondering what the expectations are when we take workstations to radiologist's house, I guess, and how they're supported. Are we expected if there's, I guess, a hands-on requirement for whatever the fix may be for, I guess, IT to actually go to their homes or for them to bring them in?
Hey, Gerard, there are different ways, of course, that you can do that. Either you can just stick it in a box and send it to someone with a direction, or you can do the more concierge service. We've tried both ways, and where we landed is we find that it's less total time on us to ask and say, are you comfortable setting this up? If we don't get an answer that is yes, then we send someone out there. And the benefits of what I've seen in sending someone remote is we establish a relationship with someone who is remote, albeit in our general zone. And from a support perspective, I've seen that then give us benefits when we're doing things in deep night or when we have outages or some permutation of that. So this was a line that initially I was very reticent to cross, and I thought that we would have issues with it. And my experience actually has been the opposite, that it's been a client satisfier, and having, in the correct use case, dispatching someone to a relatively local area has given us quite a number of benefits. Obviously, we can't do that if it's cross-country.
I was going to just add one comment. There was one health system I interacted with, and their basic policy was the first call that you get for our desktop hardware support, they will come and get it. And then after that, the RAD was expected to unplug everything and bring it in. So they basically got one free house call after the initial deployment to deal with anything. And then after that, it was the end user managed. That was their kind of SLA they had with the end users. So you can have a base like what you described, or you can have something a little more formal in terms of how it gets managed.
I see Brad has unmuted himself. Brad, you want to go ahead and ask your question?
One of the questions that I posted in the chat was related to accessibility of prior exams. Given wide variability in bandwidth, especially for rural readers outside of some of the urban areas, or maybe they've got high latency connections, what's your experience been for access to prior exams? And have you been forced to curtail access to priors based upon bandwidth challenges?
Brad, hey, it's Carl. We haven't changed any of our prefetching or our distribution. We don't do workstation caching at this point, so we haven't effectively reduced the amount of data that we're sending outbound. We had considered that as we were looking at the VPN pressure, although it hasn't gotten to the point where we've done it, and we've moved now at this point what I think is probably about the maximum number of folks remote.
And this is Ryan. I can add as well that while we don't restrict the number of priors that are being fetched or anything along those lines, if you are on a slow internet connection with our PACS vendor, they do change to what they call internet mode, which streams the studies indifferently. So it will not automatically load your typical display protocol that you would see if you're on site or if you were in their typical network configuration mode. So we can use the application to kind of handle that performance issue. And again, you can manually pull the prior into the view boxes. They just won't automatically load because of the bandwidth concerns. It will take too long, or several minutes for those to just all load appropriately, and for the radiologist to start their interpretation. So we're not restricting access to them, but we are loading the exam differently depending on the network bandwidth that's available.
Awesome. So our next question is from Bobby Rowe. Bobby Rowe, will make you live and take it away, please.
Okay, thanks very much. So my question is really just open-ended for everyone. I'm just curious what kind of bandwidth you actually have at home if you're a clinical user, or if you provide support for clinical users, what type of bandwidth do you typically see actually available for your clinical users? Thanks.
Before they connect to the VPN or after?
Yeah, it's a good question on that. Thanks, Carl. Really, it's the available bandwidth. So post-VPN compression, decompression.
Ours is pretty straightforward. The lowest that we have is about slightly less than 10 megabit, and the best case scenario we have is around 100 megabit.
Yep, and this is Ryan. So we're pretty similar. For our packs to operate at an optimum kind of replication of what you have in-house, we require 50 megs. But when you have throttling through the VPN, we do see some users go down, as low as 10 or below. In which case, that's when they switch to that internet streaming mode of loading studies. Because we weren't consistently getting that 50 meg, we work with users to make sure that they have, business class internet with high network availability speeds. And then also we're pivoting to using our own radiology focused VPN. We're just rolling it out today to all of our users, but in our testing, we've seen much better speeds by not having to share that bandwidth. And we've had some users that again have, insane 1 gig fiber connections to their house from Fios. And, they're seeing upwards of 200 megs even when on the VPN, on this dedicated radiology VPN that we're standing up. So that's a fortunate new development for us. But like I've mentioned a few times, while we recommend 50 megs, we're kind of beholden to the VPN. And to mitigate that, we use our application to load images differently depending on the detected network bandwidth.
Great. Thanks, guys.
So up next, we have John Flash, who wants a little bit more clarification on something we touched on before.
I believe John has no mic. I'll ask his question. He said, briefly touched on this, but some clarity perhaps. Is the expectation for remote reading stations to be the same FDA 510 approved? And if so, is the quality control on monitors done by IT staff and documented? Not MAMO, of course.
From our perspective, we distribute monitors that have built-in calibration tools that then phone home into our centralized monitoring system. So yes, the expectation is to have the same FDA 510K approved workstations. And yes, non-mammo is the caveat there.
Yeah, nothing to add. It's a great answer.
This is Elisa Walsh-Flanagan, myself, and there's another person on the call who works on display quality control from the supporting different institutions. And just I think that it greatly facilitates being able to do quality control on displays, having the integrated front sensors that can allow for remote calibration and quality control. But there are aspects that really the end user would also need to take care of that we are able to do for in-house workstations, but are not able to do for the ones that are in homes. So there are test patterns that are available, like forced choice identification of subtle contrast objects that radiologists can use to basically assess whether their environmental lighting, their calibration is adequate, and also test patterns that can help to ensure that there are no issues with the video card or display settings that could compromise the resolution or create basically artifacts in your viewing that are things that you can't test for with those integrated front sensors. And I think it would be really good there are some of those test patterns that are available with the quality control software that is available on many of the medical grade products that are sold for diagnostic viewing. But I know Nick Bevins, who is also on this call, has available some test patterns that people can use both for that forced choice kind of object identification as well as kind of assessment of lag that was designed for measuring display lag but could also be used for assessing system lag.
Yeah, this is Nick Bevins. I'll just chime in real quick on that. 2 comments to add to Elisa. One is that the SIIM has part of a joint technical standard with the ACR and the AAPM, which provides electronic practice guidelines that has some details on displays. So that's a great document to use if you're trying to spec out displays for home reading stations. And then beyond that, a commonly referenced document is TG18 from the AAPM. There was a recent update to that, the AAPM report 270, which provides some rationale and explanation for how to spec out display QC programs. And so all of those are applicable to home reading stations. And things like ambient settings and verifying room lighting are not things that front sensors are going to pick up. So again, putting the onus on the end user a little bit to verify that their conditions are appropriate for diagnostic reading, I think is really important and often overlooked. One other quick note on mammography reading stations. If you follow the new ACR mammography guideline, which I know has not been widely adopted, but is somewhat, there is room to move things like mammography reading stations home. You do run into more significant bandwidth issues when you try to move some of the tomosynthesis data sets across VPNs, but there's nothing necessarily that's limiting that as long as you set up your QC program so that the radiologists are fulfilling some of those technologist QC requirements under sort of the supervision of the QC technologist.
All right, Nick and Elisa, thank you so much for chiming in with your expertise. And we'll, if you have links to those patterns, we'll reach out and include those in the liner notes as well. I think we're closing in on the hour, so I'll probably just ask another question. If we see something in the chat, maybe another question or two. We touched on cloud viewers, and as we talk about, the future of radiology potentially changing and being distributed in the future, where do we see a potential for cloud viewers in the near future? I know Don talked about the death of PACS before, some 6 years ago. And do you know anything about cloud-based report generation? Don, I guess I'll start with you on that one.
Yeah, I think, first of all, a lot of people, again, cloud is a technique, it's an approach that is designed to solve a specific problem. And I think for the end user, the radiologist, if you say, oh, we have a cloud-based PACS, but it doesn't have the measurements you need for the procedures you do, they'll be completely confused. So I don't think cloud-based is in and of itself a reason to do it. I think that in many cases, it's an economic discussion. It's how much money do you want to spend internally to build business continuity and disaster recovery and business, availability or high availability type solutions, and the amount of staff it requires to support that versus outsourcing that and focusing on something else. In other words, spend your money on other areas. To me, I don't see that there's not something saying we've always wished we had cloud for this. It's not been something that's been missing. It's another way of doing something we're doing now. I don't know that The economics, especially for the long-term archiving, are absolute proven based on the way we use archive data in medical imaging, and also in terms of the economics and business model. We have to remember that in medical imaging, we get paid our technical fee upfront for the acquisition, and that's the money we get for the life cycle, where a lot of cloud applications can repurpose and resell data like your Facebook user activity many, many times over for decades. So they can generate all kinds of revenue patterns off of stuff that's in the cloud. To me, I think that there are a number of smaller organizations or reading groups that are sitting on top, like a layer on top of several health systems, that probably would find a lot of benefit for the shift to the cloud. But for a lot of organizations who have, tier 3 data centers, very mature policies, very robust network infrastructure, talented storage managers, informaticists on staff, medical physicists on staff, like all of that stuff, to replicate that or move that outside for imaging, I suspect you'd find higher ROIs in a lot of other areas of the hospital if you sit down and crunch the numbers. So you put me in the category of, I think it will happen. I just don't think it's going to happen as fast as people think it's going to happen.
All right. Well, it looks like we're just about crossing that 1 hour mark. Wanted to send out a special thanks to our guests, Carl, Don, and Ryan. Thank you for everything. And my co-hosts. We have received a lot of great questions, comments, and links to resources that we'll be including in the show notes. So please do look out for the published version of this discussion. I think this was a great format, and I think everyone learned a lot. So thanks everyone for participating.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, guys.
SIIMCast has been brought to you by the Society of Imaging Informatics in Medicine. Please visit our website at SIIM.org for more information and educational content, including webinars and an archive of prior episodes. Please follow us on Twitter at sim_tweets. Thank you to our listeners for your continued support.